The old clock above the Riverside Community Center's main entrance chimed 7 times as Maria stepped through the heavy glass doors. She paused for a moment, adjusting the strap of her worn leather purse and smoothing down her simple gray sweater. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that familiar institutional glow that reminded her of school hallways and hospital waiting rooms. Maria had driven past this building countless times over the past 5 years, but tonight was the first time she'd actually walked inside. The lobby smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and coffee from the small cafe that closed at 6. A few people wandered the halls heading to various evening classes. She could hear the distant sound of someone practicing piano scales, the notes floating down from the second floor. She checked the piece of paper in her hand one more time. Room 108. Music appreciation for adults. Tuesday evening 7 to 8:30. When she'd called to register 3 weeks ago, the woman on the phone had been so cheerful. "Oh, how wonderful that you're interested in classical music," the woman had said. "Professor Chen is fantastic. He really knows how to make it accessible for beginners." Beginners. Maria had smiled at that word, but not in a mean way. She genuinely looked forward to seeing classical music through fresh eyes, through the eyes of people discovering it for the first time. Room 108 was at the end of a long hallway lined with bulletin boards covered in colorful flyers. Pottery classes, book clubs, computer lessons for seniors, support groups for various things. The community center was clearly the heart of this small town, bringing people together for all sorts of reasons. Maria could hear voices through the door. She was a few minutes late, having spent too long in her car in the parking lot, second-guessing this decision. What was she doing here? At 58, shouldn't she have her life figured out by now? She knocked gently and pushed open the door. About 15 people sat in a circle of plastic chairs. They all turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks warm slightly. Come in," said a man in his early 40s, standing near a small piano in the corner. He had dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and wore a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt with khaki pants. "You must be Maria. I'm Professor Chen, but please just call me David." Maria nodded and took an empty chair near the back. She noticed the other students were a mix of ages. There was an elderly gentleman with a cane leaning against his chair, a young woman who looked like she might be in college, a middle-aged couple holding hands, and several others who appeared to be retirees. "We were just talking about what draws people to classical music," David continued, settling into his own chair. "Mrs. Patterson here was telling us about hearing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony at her grandson's graduation ceremony." A woman with silver hair and bright pink glasses smiled. "It just gave me goosebumps. I realized I'd been missing out on something special my whole life." David nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what we're here for. Classical music can seem intimidating, but it's really just another language of human emotion. Tonight I thought we'd focus on opera." A few people shifted in their chairs. The young woman raised her hand. "Isn't opera kind of old-fashioned? I mean, all that dramatic singing in foreign languages?" David chuckled. "I understand that reaction. Opera gets a reputation for being stuffy or elitist, but think about it this way. What's the most emotional moment you've ever experienced? Maybe falling in love, losing someone you cared about, feeling triumph after a long struggle." The room was quiet, people thinking. Opera takes those feelings and amplifies them through music and voice in ways that regular conversation never could. It's like... David paused, searching for the right comparison. "It's like the difference between a gentle rain and a thunderstorm. Both are water falling from the sky, but the experience is completely different." Maria found herself leaning forward slightly. She'd heard thousands of explanations of opera over the years, from critics and directors and fellow performers. But there was something refreshing about David's approach. He wasn't trying to impress anyone with big words or complex theories. "Let me play you something," David said, moving to the piano. "This is from an opera called La Bohème by Puccini. The character Mimi is telling the man she loves about her simple life, how she embroiders flowers and dreams of spring." His fingers found the keys, and the gentle melody filled the room. Even without words, the music painted a picture. Maria closed her eyes for just a moment, remembering the first time she'd heard this aria. She'd been 19, sitting in the back row of a theater in Chicago using her last $10 for the cheapest ticket available. "Can you hear the longing in those notes?" David asked as he played. "The way the melody rises like hope, then settles like contentment." Puccini knew how to put human emotions into musical phrases. The elderly gentleman with the cane spoke up. It does sound like someone telling a story, doesn't it? Even without the words. Exactly, David said, finishing the piece. And when you add a trained voice to this music, it becomes something magical. Opera singers spend years, sometimes decades, learning to use their voices as instruments capable of filling huge theaters without microphones. The young woman looked skeptical. Is it really that hard? I mean, singing is singing, right? David stood up from the piano bench. That's a great question, Ashley. Anyone can sing in the shower or in their car? But opera singing is like, imagine the difference between jogging around the block and running a marathon. Both are running, but one requires years of training and incredible physical conditioning. He gestured toward his throat. An opera singer has to control their breathing, their posture, their diction in multiple languages, their emotional expression, all while memorizing hours of music and often acting complex dramatic scenes. They're athletes and artists at the same time. Maria watched as David moved around the room, his passion for the subject evident in every gesture. She could see why students would respond to him. He had that rare quality of being knowledgeable without being condescending. The really amazing thing, David continued, is that each voice is completely unique. Two singers can perform the same aria, and it will be entirely different experiences. It's like fingerprints, but for emotions. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand. Do you think any of us could ever learn to sing like that? David considered this seriously. Some of you might have natural talent that could be developed with training. But honestly, most of us will never sing opera professionally. And that's perfectly fine. Understanding and appreciating it is its own reward. He glanced around the room, his eyes briefly meeting Maria's. She kept her expression neutral, interested but not overly engaged. Next week, David announced, we're going to try something interactive. Don't panic, he added quickly as he saw several worried faces. But I think the best way to understand the challenges opera singers face is to attempt it yourselves. Nothing too complicated, just enough to give you a taste of what's involved. The class spent the remaining time listening to recordings of famous opera scenes, with David explaining the stories and pointing out musical techniques. Maria found herself genuinely enjoying this perspective on music she'd lived and breathed for so many years. As the class ended and people began gathering their things, Maria moved slowly, letting others leave first. She overheard conversations about the upcoming singing assignment. I can barely carry a tune in the shower, one man was saying to his wife. Maybe we should skip next week, Ashley whispered to her friend. Maria finally stood, adjusting her purse strap again. As she headed toward the door, David called out, Maria, how did you enjoy your first class? She turned back with a gentle smile. It was very interesting. Thank you for making it so accessible. I hope we'll see you next week. Don't worry too much about the singing exercise. It's all in good fun, Maria nodded. I'll be here. As she walked back down the long hallway toward the lobby, she passed the bulletin boards again. But this time, she wasn't really seeing the pottery classes and book clubs. Instead, she was thinking about next Tuesday evening, and whether she was ready for what might happen when David asked her to sing. 3 weeks had passed since Maria first walked into room 108, and Tuesday evenings had become the highlight of her week. She looked forward to them in a way that surprised her. For the first time in years, she had somewhere to be, something to anticipate. The class had settled into a comfortable rhythm. David would arrive a few minutes early, usually with coffee stains on his shirt and sheet music spilling out of his worn briefcase. The regular students had claimed their favorite spots. Mrs. Patterson always sat in the front row with her bright pink glasses and a notebook where she wrote down everything David said. The elderly gentleman, Robert, brought his cane and positioned himself near the piano so he could see David's hands on the keys. Ashley, the college student, typically slouched in her chair but paid closer attention than she wanted to admit. Maria had found her place in the back corner, where she could observe everyone without drawing attention to herself. She'd become the quiet one, the listener. When David asked questions, others eagerly raised their hands. When he played examples, she watched the reactions on their faces more than... She focused on the music itself. Tonight felt different, though. David seemed more energetic than usual, almost restless. He kept pacing around the piano instead of sitting down, and he'd already rearranged the sheet music on the piano bench twice. Before we start tonight, David announced once everyone had settled in, I want to talk about something. We've spent 3 weeks listening to opera, discussing it, analyzing it. You've all been wonderful students, asking great questions and really thinking about what we're hearing." Mrs. Patterson beamed and adjusted her glasses. Robert nodded approvingly. "But," David continued, "I think we're missing something important. We're like people standing outside a swimming pool, talking about what it must feel like to be in the water." Ashley raised her hand. "Are you saying we need to get wet?" David laughed. "In a way, yes. I think it's time we tried singing some of these pieces ourselves." The room went completely silent. Maria felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression neutral. "Now, before anyone panics," David said quickly, seeing the looks of alarm on several faces, "this isn't about being perfect. It's about understanding what opera singers go through, the challenges they face, the skills they need." A man named Frank, who worked at the hardware store downtown, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "David, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but some of us can barely sing Happy Birthday without embarrassing ourselves." Several people nodded in agreement. The middle-aged couple, Linda and Tom, looked at each other with worry. "That's exactly my point," David said, his eyes lighting up. "Opera isn't Happy Birthday. It's exponentially more difficult. By trying it ourselves, even badly, we'll gain a deeper appreciation for what professional singers accomplish." Mrs. Patterson raised her hand tentatively. "Could we maybe start with something easier? Perhaps some folk songs or hymns?" "I understand the impulse," David replied, "but that would be like trying to understand mountain climbing by walking up a small hill. The technical demands of opera are what make it unique. The breath control, the projection, the precision required for those soaring high notes." He moved to the piano and played a simple melody. "This is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Easy to sing, right?" Several people nodded. Then he played a complex passage from Mozart's Queen of the Night aria. "And this is opera. The difference isn't just difficulty, it's an entirely different universe of skill." Robert tapped his cane against the floor thoughtfully. "So you want us to attempt the impossible to understand why it's impossible?" "Exactly," David exclaimed. "When you try to hit those high notes and run out of breath halfway through a phrase, you'll never again take for granted what you hear at the opera house." Ashley slumped further in her chair. "This is going to be humiliating." "It doesn't have to be," David assured her. "We're all in this together. Everyone will struggle, everyone will learn something, and nobody will be judged." He pulled a stack of sheet music from his briefcase. "I've selected pieces that represent different aspects of opera. Some focus on dramatic expression, others on technical virtuosity. I'll assign each of you something that matches your voice range and, hopefully, your personality." Maria watched as David began moving around the room, handing out assignments. Mrs. Patterson received Ave Maria by Schubert. "It's technically challenging but incredibly beautiful," David explained. "The sustained notes will help you understand breath control." Robert got a piece from Mozart's Don Giovanni. "This has great dramatic weight," David said. "Perfect for someone with your distinguished bearing." Frank looked terrified when he received Verdi's La Donna Immobile. "It's got a memorable melody," David encouraged him. "Once you get the tune in your head, the Italian will follow." Ashley grudgingly accepted Habanera from Bizet's Carmen. "It's got attitude," David told her with a smile. "I think you'll connect with it." One by one, David made his way around the room. Some students looked intrigued. Others appeared ready to flee. The assignments seemed thoughtful, matched to each person's personality and vocal range as best David could guess. Maria realized she'd been holding her breath. In the back corner, she'd almost managed to make herself invisible. Maybe David would run out of pieces or forget about her or... "And Maria," David said, finally reaching her corner. She looked up to find him holding a single sheet of music, smiling warmly. "I have something special for you." Her heart began to race, but she kept her expression calm and interested. "This is O mio babbino caro from Puccini's Gianni Schicchi," David said, placing the sheet music in her hands. "It's one of the most beloved arias in all of opera." Maria glanced down at the familiar notes and Italian text. She'd performed this piece hundreds of times in dozens of countries for audiences of thousands. She knew every breath mark, every dynamic marking, every subtle emotional nuance Puccini had written into those deceptively simple phrases. "It might seem straightforward," David continued, "but it's actually quite demanding. The opening requires perfect breath control. That long, sustained line has to float effortlessly, and the emotional journey from pleading to determination to pure joy requires real dramatic skill. Around the room, other students were studying their assignments with various degrees of panic. She heard Frank muttering under his breath about Italian pronunciation. Ashley was already shaking her head at her music. The really tricky part, David added, is that it sounds easy when performed well. The audience shouldn't hear the technical difficulty. They should only feel the emotion of a young woman pleading with her father. Maria nodded slowly. "It's beautiful music," she said quietly. "Puccini had a gift for melody," David agreed. "But don't let that fool you. This area has ended many a career when singers attempted it without proper preparation. The high notes at the end require perfect technique and incredible confidence." Mrs. Patterson leaned over to look at Maria's sheet music. "Oh my, that does look complicated. All those Italian words." "The text is actually quite simple," David explained. "She's asking her father to let her marry the man she loves, but the musical setting makes it soar beyond ordinary conversation into pure emotion." Tom raised his hand from across the room. "David, exactly when are we supposed to perform these? And in front of everyone?" "Next week," David announced cheerfully. "And yes, we'll all take turns. Remember, this is about learning, not performing. I want you to experience what it feels like to attempt something this challenging." Several people looked like they wanted to bolt for the door. Maria simply folded her sheet music and placed it carefully in her purse. "I know this seems intimidating," David said, addressing the room's obvious anxiety. "But think of it as an adventure. How often do you get to try something completely outside your comfort zone in a safe, supportive environment?" Robert chuckled dryly. "At my age, I try to avoid adventures." "That's exactly why you should do this," David replied with a grin. "Besides, Mrs. Patterson has already agreed to bring homemade cookies for our performance night." "How bad can it be?" Mrs. Patterson blushed and nodded. "Chocolate chip," she confirmed. As the class ended, students lingered longer than usual, discussing their assignments with mixtures of dread and excitement. Some were already forming practice groups, planning to meet before next week's class. Maria gathered her things slowly, listening to the conversations around her. "Maybe we could practice together," Linda suggested to her husband Tom. "Moral support." "I'm going to listen to recordings all week," Ashley announced. "If I'm going down, I'm going down swinging." Frank was still staring at his sheet music like it might bite him. 30 years I've been selling hammers and nails, and now I'm supposed to sing Italian opera." As Maria headed toward the door, David called out to her, "Maria, don't worry too much about next week. I chose that piece for you because there's something about your presence that suggests you might surprise yourself." She turned back with her gentle smile. "I'll do my best, Professor." "That's all any of us can do," he replied. "And please call me David." Walking to her car, Maria felt the weight of the sheet music in her purse. Behind her, she could hear other students still talking in the parking lot, their voices carrying across the cool evening air. "This is either going to be really beautiful or really ugly," she heard Ashley say. Maria unlocked her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Through the community center's windows, she could see David gathering his things, probably planning next week's class in his mind. She pulled the sheet music from her purse and looked at it one more time under the parking lot's streetlight. The notes seemed to shimmer in the artificial glow, bringing back memories of stage lights and concert halls, of audiences holding their breath during that final, soaring phrase. Next Tuesday evening was going to be very interesting indeed. The Tuesday evening that everyone had been dreading finally arrived. Maria sat in her usual corner seat, watching as her classmates filed into room 108 with the slow, deliberate movements of people walking to their own execution. The atmosphere was completely different from previous weeks. Instead of the usual cheerful chatter, nervous whispers filled the air. Mrs. Patterson had indeed brought chocolate chip cookies, arranged on paper plates near the coffee maker, but they sat mostly untouched. Even comfort food couldn't ease the anxiety that hung over the room like a heavy blanket. David seemed to sense the mood as he entered, carrying his usual briefcase and wearing what appeared to be his best shirt, a crisp blue button-down that actually looked ironed. He surveyed the room with a mixture of excitement and sympathy. "Good evening, everyone," he said, setting his briefcase down with more gentleness than usual. "I can practically feel the nerves from here." Ashley shifted in her seat, looking pale. "Professor Chen," David, "is it too late to switch to the pottery class down the hall?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Robert tapped his cane and shook his head. At my age, I never thought I'd be more terrified of singing than I was of basic training in the Army. Listen, David said, settling onto the piano bench and speaking more softly than normal. I want you all to remember something important. This isn't a competition. This isn't even really a performance. Think of it as an experiment. We're scientists studying what it feels like to attempt something extraordinary. Frank was clutching his sheet music so tightly that it was starting to wrinkle. Scientists usually don't embarrass themselves in front of their colleagues. Actually, David replied with a gentle smile, scientists fail constantly. That's how they learn. Every wrong note tonight, every forgotten word, every moment you run out of breath, that's valuable data. You're discovering firsthand what professional opera singers have mastered. Linda raised her hand tentatively. Should we go in any particular order? David looked around the room, clearly trying to gauge who might be ready to break the ice. How about we start with volunteers? Anyone feeling brave? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Maria watched as students suddenly found their shoes fascinating or became deeply interested in examining their sheet music. Finally, Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat. Well, someone has to go first. Might as well be me. A collective sigh of relief went through the room. Mrs. Patterson stood up, adjusting her bright pink glasses and smoothing down her floral blouse. She walked to the front of the room with the determined stride of someone who had raised 5 children and wasn't about to be intimidated by a piece of music. I chose Ave Maria by Schubert, she announced, as if introducing herself at a church social. I've been practicing with my grandson's karaoke machine. David moved to the piano and found the right key for her voice. Ready when you are, Mrs. Patterson. She nodded firmly and David began the gentle introduction. When Mrs. Patterson started singing, it was immediately clear why most people don't attempt classical music. Her voice, pleasant enough for church hymns, struggled with the sustained notes. She ran out of breath during the long phrases and had to pause at awkward moments. The Latin pronunciation was questionable at best, but something wonderful happened. Despite the technical struggles, Mrs. Patterson sang with genuine emotion. When she reached the word Maria, her voice softened with real reverence. The melody, even imperfectly rendered, still carried its beauty. When she finished, the room erupted in supportive applause. Mrs. Patterson beamed, her cheeks flushed with accomplishment. That was lovely, David said, and he clearly meant it. Now, what did you notice about the challenges you faced? I couldn't hold those long notes, Mrs. Patterson admitted, and I had no idea how much breath control was needed. Professional singers must have lungs like athletes. Exactly, David nodded. You've just experienced one of the fundamental requirements of opera singing. Thank you for being brave enough to go first. Robert volunteered next, leveraging himself up with his cane and walking slowly to the front. His piece from Don Giovanni was darker, more dramatic. His elderly voice cracked on the higher notes, but he brought a dignity to the performance that was genuinely moving. When he sang about honor and death, you could hear decades of life experience in every phrase. Ashley followed, attacking Habanera from Carmen with more attitude than technique. She missed half the notes but captured the seductive, rebellious spirit of the piece so well that it almost didn't matter. Her youthful energy transformed the classroom into a Spanish tavern for 3 minutes. One by one, the students took their turns. Frank's La Donna Immobile was a disaster from a technical standpoint. He forgot words, sang off-key, and looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. But when David pointed out how Verdi's melody was so strong it remained recognizable, even through the mistakes, Frank actually smiled. Tom and Linda performed a duet from La Bohème, holding hands and looking into each other's eyes. Their voices didn't blend particularly well, and they both struggled with the Italian, but the love between them was so evident that several people in the room got a little teary-eyed. With each performance, David offered gentle feedback, always finding something positive while pointing out the technical challenges that professional singers overcome. The students were learning not just about opera but about courage, about trying something completely outside their comfort zones. As the evening progressed, Maria felt her heart beating faster. There were only a few students left, and she could feel David's eyes occasionally glancing in her direction. She had been hoping she might be forgotten, that they would run out of time, that somehow she could slip away without performing. But David was keeping careful track. Maria, he said as the last volunteer before her finished, I believe you're our final performer tonight. The room turned to look at her expectantly. After watching everyone else be vulnerable and brave, there was no way to gracefully decline. Maria stood slowly, her sheet music slightly trembling in her hands. "Take your time," David said kindly, moving to the piano. "What piece did I assign you again?" "O mio babino caro," Maria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Several students looked sympathetic. They had all heard recordings of this aria during previous classes and knew how demanding it was. "Ah, yes," David said, finding the music on his piano. "This is a beautiful piece, but quite challenging. Remember, just do your best. We're all learning together." Maria walked to the front of the room on unsteady legs. She could feel everyone watching her with the same supportive energy they had given all the other performers. These people had become her friends over the past month. They had no expectations except that she would try. She stood facing the class, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she appeared to be, a nervous, middle-aged woman about to attempt something far beyond her abilities. Her hands fidgeted with her simple cardigan. She took a deep breath that seemed shaky. "I'm quite nervous," she admitted, and several students nodded encouragingly. "That's completely normal," Ashley called out. "We all were. Just remember to breathe," Mrs. Patterson added helpfully. David positioned his hands over the piano keys. "Ready, Maria?" She nodded, though she didn't look ready at all. She looked terrified. The familiar opening notes of Puccini's masterpiece began to fill the room. The gentle, flowing melody that had introduced countless sopranos to audiences around the world. David played with sensitivity, giving Maria space to find her entrance. The moment arrived. Maria opened her mouth to sing the first phrase, "O mio babino caro," and then everything changed. The first note that emerged from Maria's lips was not the tentative, uncertain sound everyone expected. It was not the well-meaning but flawed attempt they had heard from every other student that evening. It was perfect. Pure, crystalline, and absolutely perfect. The note soared through the room with a clarity and beauty that seemed impossible. It filled every corner of the space, reaching the back walls and wrapping around each person like silk. David's hands froze above the piano keys for just a split second before he recovered and continued playing. But his eyes had gone wide with shock. Around the room, students' mouths dropped open. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her chest. Robert gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles went white. Ashley sat up straight for the first time in weeks, but Maria herself seemed transformed. Her posture had straightened, her nervous fidgeting had stopped, and her entire presence commanded the room in a way that was breathtaking. The simple woman in the gray cardigan was gone, replaced by someone who belonged on the world's greatest stages, and she was just getting started. The Italian words flowed from her lips like poetry, each syllable perfectly pronounced, each phrase shaped with decades of experience. The melody that had challenged every other student seemed to float effortlessly from her voice, as natural as breathing. Mi piace, bello. Bello. The room was completely silent except for the piano and Maria's voice. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. They were witnessing something that none of them had expected, something that would change how they thought about music, about talent, about the quiet woman who had sat in the back corner for 4 weeks. David continued playing, but his expression had shifted from encouragement to complete amazement. His musical training told him exactly what he was hearing, and what he was hearing should have been impossible. As Maria continued singing, the transformation became even more remarkable. She moved through the phrases of O mio babino caro with the effortless grace of someone who had lived with this music for decades. Every breath was perfectly placed, every word shaped with meaning, every note floating through the air as if weightless. Vado in Porta Rossa a comprar l'anello. The words told the story of a young woman pleading with her father. But Maria's interpretation brought layers of emotion that none of the students had ever heard before. When she sang about going to buy the wedding ring, her voice sparkled with joy. When she mentioned throwing herself into the river if denied, there was genuine anguish that made several people in the room catch their breath. David had stopped looking at his sheet music entirely. His hands moved across the piano keys from memory, while his eyes remained fixed on Maria, watching this impossible performance unfold in his community center classroom. 30 years of teaching music had not prepared him for this moment. Mrs. Patterson had tears streaming down her cheeks behind her pink glasses. She had thought her own attempt at Ave Maria was emotional, But this was something else entirely. This was what music was supposed to sound like. Robert sat perfectly still, his military training kicking in as his mind tried to process what his ears were telling him. He had heard some beautiful voices in his 83 years, but nothing like this. Nothing that made the hair on his arm stand up and his heart race like he was 20 again. Ashley had completely forgotten to maintain her usual bored teenager pose. She was leaning forward in her chair, her mouth slightly open, watching Maria like she was seeing magic happen right in front of her. As the aria moved toward its climax, Maria's voice began to soar higher. The simple gray cardigan and modest appearance seemed to fade away entirely. She was no longer the quiet woman who sat in the back corner. She was pure music, pure emotion, commanding the space with a presence that filled every corner of the room. Selamasi, Selamasi. The repeated phrases built with increasing intensity, each one more beautiful than the last. Maria's voice had a richness and power that seemed impossible to come from a human throat. The high notes that had defeated every other student rang out clear and strong, sustained with a breath control that defied explanation. Frank had stopped worrying about his own terrible performance. Linda and Tom were holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. The other students sat transfixed, witnessing something they knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. And then came the final phrase. The moment every opera lover waits for in this area, Maria's voice rose to the climactic high note, floating it with such beauty and control that it seemed to hang in the air like a perfect crystal. The room held its collective breath as she sustained the note, then brought it down to the gentle, loving conclusion. Si, Sandro. As the last note faded and David played the final piano chords, the silence in the room was profound. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They all sat in the aftermath of something extraordinary, trying to process what they had just experienced. Finally, David's hands fell from the piano keys. He turned slowly on the bench to face Maria, his expression a mixture of awe, confusion, and growing realization. That was... he began, then stopped. He seemed to be searching for words that didn't exist. That was... The spell was broken as someone began to clap. It was Robert, his weathered hands creating sharp sounds in the quiet room. Soon everyone was applauding, but it wasn't the supportive, encouraging applause they had given each other earlier in the evening. This was different. This was the kind of applause reserved for moments of greatness. Maria stood at the front of the room, and for the first time all evening, she looked like herself again. The commanding presence that had filled the space while she sang seemed to settle back into the modest woman in the gray cardigan. But something had changed. There was no way to pretend anymore. David stood up from the piano bench, moving slowly toward her. His musical training was screaming at him, telling him what he had just heard was impossible. You don't stumble upon voices like that in community center music classes. Voices like that belonged in the world's greatest opera houses. Maria, he said quietly, his voice barely steady. Who are you? The question hung in the air. Everyone in the room was looking at her, waiting. Mrs. Patterson had stopped crying, but her tissues were clutched in her hands. Ashley was sitting on the edge of her chair. Frank looked like he was seeing a ghost. Maria took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was still the same gentle tone they had all grown used to over the past month. My full name is Maria Benedetti, she said simply. I was Maria Rossetti before I married my husband 35 years ago. David's face went pale. Even if that name didn't mean anything to the other students, it meant everything to him. He had studied music history, had recordings of all the great sopranos, had written papers about the legendary performers of the late 20th century. Maria Benedetti, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The Maria Benedetti? I don't know about the, Maria replied with a small smile. But yes, I sang professionally for about 30 years. Professionally where? David asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer was going to be overwhelming. La Scala, the Metropolitan Opera, Covent Garden, Vienna State Opera. Maria's voice trailed off as she saw the effect her words were having on David. Many places. Mrs. Patterson looked confused. I'm sorry, dear, but I don't know what those places are. David turned to address the class, his excitement barely contained. Those are the most prestigious opera houses in the world. Maria just listed the places where only the greatest singers of their generation are invited to perform. He turned back to Maria, his mind racing. Wait, Maria Benedetti. You sang Tosca at the Met in 1995, I have that recording. And your Butterfly at Covent Garden in 1998. That's considered one of the definitive performances. Maria nodded quietly. Yes, those were good nights. Good nights? David's voice cracked slightly. Your Butterfly is taught in music schools. I play recordings of your performances for my university students. The room was completely silent as everyone tried to absorb this information. Ashley was the first to speak. Wait, so you're famous, like really famous? I was known in certain circles, Maria replied modestly. David was shaking his head in disbelief. Known in certain circles? Maria, you were one of the most celebrated sopranos of your generation. I saw you perform at Carnegie Hall in 2003. You brought the entire audience to their feet. Robert tapped his cane on the floor, trying to get everyone's attention. Could someone explain this to those of us who don't know about opera? David took a deep breath, clearly trying to organize his thoughts. Imagine discovering that someone in your local basketball league was actually Michael Jordan, just playing for fun. Or finding out the person helping you with your garden was secretly one of the world's greatest landscape architects. Frank's eyes widened. So she's the Michael Jordan of opera? She's one of the greatest sopranos who ever lived, David said, his voice filled with reverence. And she's been sitting in the back of our community center class for a month, letting me explain basic opera concepts to her. Maria looked slightly embarrassed. I enjoyed your explanations. You have a gift for making music accessible. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand tentatively. Maria, dear, if you're so famous, what are you doing here with us? It was a fair question, and everyone waited for the answer. Maria looked around the room at these people who had become her friends, who had welcomed her without knowing anything about her past accomplishments. I retired 5 years ago when my husband passed away, she said quietly. Giuseppe had been sick for a long time, and I spent his final years taking care of him instead of performing. After he died, I felt lost. I didn't know who I was if I wasn't a singer anymore. The room was completely still. Everyone could hear the sadness in her voice. I moved to this town to start over, to be just a regular person, but I missed music so much. When I saw the advertisement for your class in the newspaper, I thought maybe I could remember what it felt like to love music again. Without all the pressure and expectations. She looked directly at David. I never meant to deceive anyone. I just wanted to sit in the back and listen, to remember why I fell in love with opera in the first place. David sat down heavily in the nearest chair. This is incredible. This is absolutely incredible. Ashley was staring at Maria with new eyes. So when you were asking those basic questions about opera in our first class, I was curious about how someone explains it to people hearing it for the first time, Maria admitted. I've been surrounded by opera my whole life. I forgot what it sounded like to fresh ears. The silence stretched on as everyone processed this revelation. Then Mrs. Patterson stood up and walked over to Maria, wrapping her in a warm hug. You poor dear, she said. All this time you've been grieving and we didn't even know. Soon others were standing too, gathering around Maria. But not because she was famous, because she was their friend, and she had been carrying sadness they hadn't realized. So, Robert said with a slight smile, I guess this means our terrible singing tonight was even more embarrassing than we thought. Everyone laughed, and the tension in the room finally broke. Maria laughed too, and for the first time in years it sounded completely genuine. 6 months had passed since that incredible Tuesday evening when Maria revealed her true identity. The small community center had become the talk of the town, not because of scandal or gossip, but because something beautiful was growing there. Maria sat in David's office on a quiet Thursday afternoon, surrounded by stacks of sheet music and concert programs. The walls were covered with photos from various performances, and Maria smiled seeing pictures from their recent concerts mixed in with David's university events. I still can't believe how much has changed, David said, looking up from the piano where he was arranging music for their next performance. 6 months ago I was teaching basic music appreciation to 15 people. Now we have a waiting list of over 50. Maria nodded, watching through the window as Mrs. Patterson led a small group of newer students through vocal exercises in the main rehearsal room. She's become quite the teacher herself. She insists on being called Assistant Instructor Patterson now, David chuckled. And honestly, she's better at explaining breath control to beginners than I am. She remembers what it felt like to struggle with it. The growth had been unexpected but wonderful. Word of Maria's presence had initially brought curiosity seekers, but David and Maria had worked together to create something more meaningful. They developed a program that welcomed people at all skill levels, from complete beginners to those with some musical background. "How's Robert doing with his new students?" Maria asked. "He's incredible," David replied with obvious pride. Who knew that a retired Army sergeant would be perfect for teaching stage presence and confidence? He has them standing tall and projecting their voices like they're addressing troops. Through the window, they could see Robert working with Ashley and 3 other young people from the local college. He was using his cane to point out posture problems, his military bearing somehow making even opera seem practical and achievable. Ashley had become one of their biggest success stories. After being rejected from her college's opera workshop, she had thrown herself into studying with Maria and David. 3 months later, she auditioned again and not only got accepted but received a small scholarship. "I have something to tell you," Maria said, turning away from the window. "I got a call yesterday." David looked up, sensing something important in her tone. "The Metropolitan Opera is planning a gala benefit concert next spring. They want me to participate." David's eyes widened. "Maria, that's incredible. What did you tell them?" "I said I'd think about it," she replied quietly. "A year ago, I would have said no immediately. The thought of performing professionally again seemed impossible. And now?" Maria was quiet for a moment, considering. "Now I remember what I love about singing. But I also know what I love about this." She gestured toward the window where their students were working with dedication and joy. "You don't have to choose," David said gently. "This community will be here whether you perform at the Met or not. I know. But if I do accept, I want to do something special. I want to bring some of our students with me." David nearly dropped his sheet music. "To the Metropolitan Opera? Not to perform on that stage," Maria clarified with a smile. "But to attend, to see what professional opera looks like up close. Mrs. Patterson has never been to New York. Robert keeps talking about wanting to experience Lincoln Center. Ashley needs to see what she's working toward." The idea was taking shape as she spoke. "And maybe, if they'll let me, I could dedicate my performance to Giuseppe. And to all the people who've helped me remember why music matters." David sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gesture. "Maria, do you know what that would mean to them?" "It would mean everything to me," she replied simply. A knock on the door interrupted them. Mrs. Patterson peeked in, her pink glasses slightly fogged from the exertion of teaching. "Maria, dear, I hate to bother you, but we have a situation with the Henderson boy." Maria stood immediately. Tommy Henderson was 8 years old and had been coming to their new children's program for the past month. His mother brought him because he sang constantly at home and school, often getting in trouble for it. They found Tommy sitting alone in the corner of the main room, looking dejected. The other children were gathered around Ashley, who was showing them how to project their voices without shouting. "What's wrong, Tommy?" Maria asked, sitting down beside him. "I can't do it right," he said, his lower lip trembling. "Everyone else sounds good, but when I sing, it's too loud and weird." Maria exchanged a glance with Mrs. Patterson. Tommy had an unusually powerful voice for his age, and it intimidated him as much as it impressed the adults. "Can I tell you a secret?" Maria said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Tommy nodded. "When I was your age, my voice was so loud that my teacher made me stand in the back of the church choir. I felt like a freak." Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? Really? And you know what I learned? Having a big voice isn't a problem to be fixed. It's a gift to be shared, but you have to learn how to control it, like learning to drive a powerful car." She stood and extended her hand to him. "Want to try something with me?" For the next 20 minutes, Maria worked with Tommy on breathing and control, showing him how to channel his natural power into something beautiful, rather than overwhelming. The other children gathered around to watch, fascinated. By the end of the session, Tommy was singing a simple song with confidence and joy, his voice strong but controlled. The other children applauded and his face lit up with pride. "You see," Maria said, kneeling down to his level. "Your voice isn't too much. It's exactly right for you." As the afternoon classes wound down, Maria found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been hiding from music, afraid that returning to it would only remind her of everything she had lost. Now she was surrounded by it every day, but in a completely different way. The music here wasn't about perfection, or competition, or reviews. It was about discovery, community, and the simple joy of making something beautiful together. Mrs. Patterson's wobbly high notes brought as much satisfaction as any standing ovation at La Scala. Robert's growing confidence in his bass voice was as rewarding as any five-star review. That evening, after all the students had gone home, Maria and David sat at the piano together. David was playing softly, just random melodies that came to mind. "I've made my decision about the Met Gala," Maria said. David's hands paused on the keys. "I'm going to do it, but I want to sing something different than what they probably expect." "What do you have in mind?" Maria smiled. "I want to sing O mio babbino caro, the same aria I performed that night when everything changed." David resumed playing, finding the familiar melody. "That's perfect.